We've broken down our quarterback dynasty rankings, our running back dynasty rankings. So now today, we're taking a dive into our top 36 wide receiver dynasty rankings. We're going to hash out how do we battle with age and upside, seasoned veterans. 36 wide receivers, a lot to get into here, Ty. So let's dive on in and not waste any time. We're going to start in the S tier, work our way down. And in the S tier, it's a larger tier than some may think, but it's Ja'Marr Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Puka Nacua, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. The two that you could have by themselves in this tier are Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've known that they are superstar status for the past 4 years, right? CeeDee Lamb had his breakout in 2023. Puka Nacua, obviously his rookie year. Amon-Ra St. Brown has been the definition of consistent in this Ben Johnson offense. But like you said, Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson feel like they are just a half step above the other three guys in this tier.
And I think if we were talking about these rankings last offseason, I think we would have said it's a big three. It's Ja'Marr Chase, Justin Jefferson, and CeeDee Lamb. The thing with CeeDee Lamb, though, 101 receptions on still 152 targets this year. So it's not like the alpha volume is going anywhere. He didn't pile up more. He didn't pile up over 1,200 yards, though. He hit 1,194. His 11.8 yards per reception was a career low this year, and he only caught 6 touchdowns. He squeaked out a wide receiver 7 finish in fantasy points per game. And I don't really want to overreact to one season, but again, Mike McCarthy just got canned. Do you have any concern that CeeDee Lamb might be falling out of the S tier and dynasty rankings a year from now? Or is this just a blip one season? Let's not worry about it too much.
I have to think it's a 1 year, kind of fluke season, just because you did have Dak Prescott go down in the middle of the year. So then you have to finish the year with Cooper Rush. And for whatever reason this year, Dallas just decided to not have a run game in their offense. They were playing with one hand, tied behind their back the entire season because they didn't have a run game, right? So I have to think that the next coach that comes in, if they can get the running game back up and going again, CeeDee Lamb is going to solidify himself in this S tier.
Yeah, I think you named probably the two most important things there. Dallas not having a run game, so they immediately become one-dimensional on offense. But I think Dak Prescott is probably maybe the bigger thing out of the two, because even through the first 9 weeks of the season, CeeDee Lamb was still the wide receiver 4 overall. He was still averaging 18.5 fantasy points per game. So it's not like CeeDee Lamb was a wide receiver 7, a middle of the pack wide receiver 1 throughout the entire season. When Dak Prescott was there, he was clearly a top 4, top 5, borderline top 3. I feel like I just made myself redundant by saying all those rankings, but obviously he was in that upper echelon of wide receivers, right? So I do think he still belongs here, but I'm curious to see how this regime, how this scheme changes with Mike McCarthy out and what they bring in this offseason. I don't think it changes that CeeDee Lamb is still an S-tier dynasty wide receiver because CeeDee Lambs just don't grow on trees, right? But I also think when you look at Puka Nacua's and Amon-Ra St. Brown's as well, these dudes don't grow on trees either, especially Amon-Ra St. Brown, because this dude is just consistent, man. And when you look at these two, in terms of fantasy points per game this year, I mean, they're as neck and neck as they get. Puka was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game this year at 18.8 fantasy points per game. And Amon-Ra St. Brown was at 18.6. He was the wide receiver 4. How do you split hairs between these two? Are you just you know what? Amon-Ra is the consistent. He's going to give me somewhere between 14 to 19 every single week. Or do you kind of maybe not the variability of Puka, but Puka can give you 12 to 22 on a given week. I have Puka ranked ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown in my dynasty rankings. I actually have Puka ahead of CeeDee Lamb in my dynasty rankings. But how do you split the hairs between Puka and Amon-Ra St. Brown?
I think the best way to say it is what happened this year, right? This year was a little bit different than 2023 for Amon-Ra St. Brown, where we did see some single-digit performances and some weeks, some weeks that may have cost you because, again, he was your first-round pick. But I have to think that a big reason why Amon-Ra was not as relied on as much as he was last year, or 2 years ago now, is because we saw an emergence from Jameson Williams.
Mhm.
And in my opinion, I don't think Jameson Williams takes another step or a big enough step to really take away from Amon-Ra St. Brown, even if Ben Johnson leaves. Because I think that's also a fair point to say that, because we were deciding, like, does Amon-Ra St. Brown go in the A tier? Because that's, again, Ben Johnson leaves, what happens to this Detroit Lions offense? But again, for me, I still have faith that Amon-Ra St. Brown is the clear one in that Detroit offense versus Puka. I think what concerns me is how many more years are we going to get with Matthew Stafford? That's the
Which is
biggest thing
fair.
for me.
Yeah.
Now, Stafford is 36, I believe, 37. So you could say like 2 to 3 more years. So at that point, it's kind of, it feels harsh to kind of penalize Puka for 2 or 3 more years of Matt Stafford. But again, I think Amon-Ra still young enough on a team that is not going to be, going through major changes, obviously, besides Ben Johnson leaving.
I was gonna say, I'm like, Ben
Yeah.
Johnson leaving, I think that's
Right.
worth noting, but
Yeah. So again, I've been talking in circles about it, but I have less hairs to pick with Amon-Ra St. Brown than I do with Puka.
I just love the alpha upside with Puka, man. I mean, it's clearly him in the Rams offense over Cooper Kupp, and obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown is ahead of Jameson Williams as well. But again, these are two where is Matthew Stafford going to start declining? What happens when Ben Johnson seemingly inevitably takes a head coaching job in this coaching cycle? This is why we do these rankings, right? Because you could have Amon-Ra St. Brown as your dynasty wide receiver 3 ahead of CeeDee Lamb and Puka Nacua. I wouldn't blame you one bit. I have Puka Nacua ahead of CeeDee Lamb. I wouldn't blame you for that. Again, we're splitting hairs in the S tier here. The point is, these are cornerstone piece guys that you can rely on for years to come. So let's move to the A tier then, where we have maybe a few more questions, but still loaded with studs here, because you have Malik Nabers, Nico Collins, Brian Thomas Jr., Drake London, and AJ Brown. I want to start by debating and comparing Nico Collins and Malik Nabers, because I think a lot of people might say Nico Collins is a guy who could borderline be in that S tier. But I actually think the question is should Malik Nabers be in the S tier? Because you look at these guys, Malik Nabers this year in his rookie season, 32.2% target share. That led the entire league. He was first in first read share. He was second in team market share in terms of receiving yards. He was third in fantasy points per route run. You look at Nico Collins, fourth in fantasy points per route run and fourth in receiving yards per game, which was ahead of Malik Nabers, obviously. These two are actually more comparable than I think when it comes to dynasty rankings. So Cameron has Malik Nabers up a wide receiver 4, so he would have Malik Nabers in the S tier. Should we actually have Malik Nabers in the S tier? Because I get I just kind of cherry picked stats and shared them with you all, but what's clear is that Malik Nabers is an alpha. He's probably the best wide receiver that's come out of this class this year. Should he be an S tier wide receiver? That's the question.
I get the argument for putting him in an S tier, right? Just from a athletic and player perspective, Nabers is an elite talent already. What keeps him in the A tier for me is I'm worried that he's going to be stuck in quarterback purgatory for like the next 4 years, right?
Yeah.
This is like, even if they bring in a Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders in the draft this year, I still don't feel great about Malik Nabers. Like, and I need to find a better way to say I don't feel great, because again, I have him as my wide receiver 6 in Dynasty. So
Right.
I still feel good about Malik Nabers, but to crack that S tier, I need him to get better quarterback play. I don't think it comes from any of the quarterbacks in this draft. I don't think it really comes from any of the quarterbacks in this free agency class either, right? A lot of people could say that, like Sam Darnold to the Giants. Would that take Malik Nabers to the S tier? My opinion, no. So I know that Sam Darnold just supported a Justin Jefferson wide receiver 2 year, and we still have Jefferson in the S tier, but it's because he has Kevin O'Connell, right? You're going to have Brian Daboll, who has had success with offenses in the past, but the track record is not there compared to Kevin O'Connell. So for me, it's the quarterback question. And again, with the likely, players that will be the quarterback for the Giants next year, it doesn't give me enough confidence to push them into that S tier.
So the immediate pushback I have is Malik Nabers finished as a wide receiver 6, averaging 18.2 fantasy points per game this year in 15 games played, while Nico Collins in 12 games played 17.6 fantasy points per game. So Malik Nabers has already finished ahead of Nico Collins with Drew Lock, Tommy DeVito, and Daniel Jones throwing him the football, right? Like, that's the counterpunch. That being said, I'm with you. I just have more trust in CJ Stroud long term. I know it didn't look great this second year, but I think he can bounce back in his third year when he gets a full healthy season of Nico Collins as the alpha. He's not missing 5 games with a hamstring injury, right? I still had Nico ranked ahead of Malik Nabers in Dynasty, but like again, we're talking 6 and 7 in my rankings. It's not. It's not like it's a far gap apart. You could have Malik Nabers ahead of Nico Collins, and like the more I think about it, the more I think it might just not matter. Malik Nabers is that special of a talent at 22 years old that he probably should be ahead of Nico Collins in Dynasty rankings. Let's talk about another rookie, though, Ty, because Brian Thomas Jr. is in this tier as well. He caught 87 of 133 targets this year for over 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 11 in fantasy points per game, despite being the wide receiver 21 in expected fantasy points per game. What needs to happen for Brian Thomas Jr. to have that Justin Jefferson-esque sophomore leap next year? Because after his rookie season, it seems like sky's the limit when he's getting it done with Mac Jones. So what happens when the Jaguars potentially bring in? I mean, I'm not going to speak it into existence. This isn't confirmed, but if they bring in a Ben Johnson, a Liam Cohen, like, what needs to happen for Brian Thomas Jr. to launch himself, into that Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb stratosphere?
For me, it's the usage. The wide receiver 21 usage is what still kind of holds me back a little bit,
Sure.
right? And the thing is, like, Brian Thomas Jr. is a big play wide receiver, right? There were a ton of highlights of him downfield, contested catches, or 70-yard bombs from Mac Jones of all quarterbacks, right? For me, I just want to see Brian Thomas Jr. really emerge and get the alpha treatment in that wide receiver room where he is going to be, a top 10 wide receiver in usage, right? And you had said at the very beginning, right, to have that Justin Jefferson-esque sophomore leap, to contextualize that, Jefferson went from 88 to 108 receptions, went from 125 targets to 167 targets,
Yep.
1,400 yards to 1,600 yards, right? Is usage for me. And I think if they nail the right coach, they will see that Brian Thomas Jr. is an alpha wide receiver, that he can be that kind of wide receiver. So ultimately, it's going to come down to who they hire, right? You mentioned Ben Johnson, Liam Cohen. I'm just going to say it doesn't feel like there are many offensive gurus in this, carousel of coaches this year. That being said, if you can bring in a Liam Cohen, right, because it feels like Ben Johnson, I don't want to say it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to Vegas, but it feels like he's not going to go to Jacksonville. So I think if you can bring in a Liam Cohen, right, seeing what he did with Chris Godwin, seeing what he did with Baker Mayfield, I would have faith in Brian Thomas taking that leap into the S tier going into 2026.
Yeah, into 2026. You mean 2020? So you're looking a year ahead even. I'm thinking like 2025, this upcoming NFL season. So you think it takes another year yet?
Because I would need to see it first.
Okay. All right, fair enough. I'm just asking about 2025. Like, I don't think it's impossible to think Brian Thomas Jr. finds himself in the S tier at the end of next season, because we look back and we do think we do see he got 155 targets. He did go for 1,500 yards. He did score another 8 to 11 touchdowns next year. And all of a sudden we're like, yes, this dude's an alpha. We should have been thinking about him like a Justin Jefferson now. Obviously it's too premature to predict all that, right? Because we got to make sure Trevor Lawrence is, balling at an acceptable level next year. We do need to see if a Liam Cohen or a Ben Johnson potentially ends up there. Again, we're going through the coaching cycle right now. That will make a difference at the end of the day. But what's clear is that Brian Thomas Jr. is one of the most valuable wide receivers to have in Dynasty right now. And what's crazy is that there's probably still untapped potential after what he gave us in his rookie season. So Brian Thomas, well-deserved of his A-tier ranking. And I want to close out this A-tier by comparing Drake London and AJ Brown. Two guys who are actually very, very similar 2024 campaigns. You look at their target shares. AJ Brown had a 31.1% target share. Drake London 27.2. I believe both of those were top 5 in the league this year in terms of target share. Targets per route run. Drake London actually the wide receiver 3 in targets per route run. AJ Brown was a wide receiver 8. First read share. These are elite numbers we're talking about here. AJ Brown was the first read on 42.1% of his routes, and Drake London on 35.4. Those were back to back. Again, both top 5 numbers there. They are so statistically similar. I could keep going in the statistics that they are like neck and neck in. You have Drake London ranked ahead of AJ Brown in your dynasty rankings. Is this purely just an age thing? Or are you like just that confident in Michael Penix moving forward that like, yeah, Drake London is just ahead of AJ Brown right now?
I maybe you could say it's recency bias because week 18, we saw Drake London catch 2 touchdowns, like 180 yards, right? Like, not saying that we're going to get that week in, week out from Drake London, but Drake London doesn't have a Devontae Smith problem in his offense, right?
It's a Darnell Mooney problem.
Yeah, well, that's wow, shaking in my boots over here about that one. Jeez. That being said, Darnell Mooney, nice little player. But
hey, he's great. He's a nice little player, man.
Nice little player. But again, Drake London is the clear one in that offense. AJ Brown is also the clear one in Philly, but there's just less competition, 4 years younger. And again, Michael Penix, that connection to Drake London, that's gonna, I'm not gonna sit here and say it's gonna feed generations, but that's the vibe that we were left with from Atlanta at the end of the year. So now, and you could also say too for AJ Brown, what happens to Kellen Moore? Right, Kellen Moore leaves.
Yeah.
We bring it, and Philly makes the mistake of the wrong coordinator again. Like they get another Brian Johnson calling plays. Like, boy, it's gonna get real ugly. So that's why I've got a little more confidence in Drake London to rank him over AJ Brown.
Yeah, those are two that you could split hairs on entirely. The only reason why I have AJ Brown ahead of Drake London is like I'm not saying we obviously didn't see the best of Michael Penix, right? Like he's going to grow, he's going to learn, he's going to develop. I just know what I get with AJ Brown and Jalen Hurts, and that is an alpha when he's out on the field, right? I'm a guy who could easily be a top 5 fantasy wide receiver year in, year out. I'm not quite ready to get there yet with Drake London. But the age difference, you could totally make the case of like, well, Drake London is younger and they're putting up similar production, right? To which I'm like, yeah, you got me there. I totally understand that. So again, how do we decipher age versus production versus potential with a Michael Penix, right? These are all things we hope to provide a little bit of context for here. So if you're going to stick around this offseason, we got a lot more Dynasty content coming for you. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications as well, so be alerted when all of our newest content is out. We've got some Dynasty buys and sells coming up. We're going to have plenty of rookie analysis this offseason as well to get you ready for your rookie draft. So if you are a lover of Dynasty Fantasy Football, you're looking to get started in the Dynasty Football landscape, this is the channel you want to be at. So again, make sure you subscribe, turn on those notifications so you know when all of our newest episodes are out. Let's move on to the B tier now, Ty. Still only 5 players in this tier. We'll get to our mega tier shortly. But this has Garrett Wilson, T. Higgins, Ladd McConkey, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, and Marvin Harrison Jr. to wrap out this tier. Let's start with Garrett Wilson. He was the wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game this year, despite being the wide receiver 7 in expected fantasy points per game. He barely crossed 1,100 yards on 154 targets, which those 154 targets were tied for 4th most in the league this year. So this is another disappointing season from Garrett Wilson. We keep trying to push him up into the top 10, into the top 7 of Dynasty wide receiver rankings. Aaron Rodgers is back this year. He's fully healthy, and it was a disappointing season from the New York Jets. They brought in Davante Adams midseason to take away some of that target volume as well. But it seems like all signs are pointing towards Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams moving on, or the Jets moving on from Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams this offseason. But is this really just a dead dream that we're holding on to? Because that's how I'm kind of feeling with Garrett Wilson is if he doesn't have Aaron Rodgers, well, we're back to square one. We're back to Tyrod Taylor next year. Or God forbid they try and take a quarterback in the first round of this year's draft, right? Like it feels like we're holding on to a dead dream, man. So how in the world is Garrett Wilson still a top 12 dynasty wide receiver?
Well, I was going to say something that does not make him sound like a top 12 dynasty wide receiver, because I was about to say, we just looking at Chris Godwin or Chris Olave 2.0.
Well, so, but I mean, that's the question we have to ask here, right? I mean, it's disappointment after disappointment. And like, I get it from a fantasy points per game perspective, it wasn't as bad, but we can't be ranking Garrett Wilson as a top 12 guy if we actually don't have the confidence he can get there.
I think this is one of the players where we got a little blinded by the talent of the player instead of actually
bet on talent.
Right.
I will continue to do that.
Yeah. The talent here is amazing, but the problem that like I had said with Malik Nabers, the quarterback situation here is I don't know how it gets better.
Yeah.
Just with how this team is structured. Money, draft picks, all that stuff. I just don't know how it gets, like, I don't know how we can improve from Aaron Rodgers, right? So maybe there's some hope that, giving it another year or two will kind of, I don't know, reboot the quarterback position for the Jets and get Garrett Wilson kind of solidified into this top 12 dynasty wide receiver status. But it's murky, man. It is not clear. And again, the talent is there, but the situation around him, it just doesn't make you feel great.
No, because even last year, in 2023, when Garrett Wilson is drawing 168 targets, the fourth most in the league, he's barely pulling across 12 and a half fantasy points per game. I mean, it's brutal. So we can sit here and say the volume, but is Tyrod Taylor going to toss him 7-8 touchdowns? It's murky for Garrett Wilson, man. So I know he's at the top of this B tier, but like, it's really time to start having a conversation. And I don't know if it's worth putting T. Higgins or Lab McConkey or JSN or Marv ahead of him, right? But like, he's probably the one I feel the least confident in this tier. If I'm being perfect, like, if we come back next season, I could see any of the other 3-4 guys in this tier potentially getting a bump to the A tier. Garrett Wilson's the one where I'm like, he might be stuck in B/C tier purgatory if they don't figure this offense out soon. So we'll put a bow on that with Garrett Wilson, because our tone is pessimistic, if you can't tell. I think Garrett Wilson is going to be a wildly popular sell candidate in dynasty formats this upcoming offseason, and it'll be interesting to see what people think they can actually get for a Garrett Wilson. Let's talk about T. Higgins. After returning from injury in week 11 this year, he was stellar. Wide receiver 4 in fantasy points per game, wide receiver 4 in expected fantasy points per game, the wide receiver 10 in fantasy points per route run. I think T. Higgins remains a Cincinnati Bengal. I think we need to start with that. Where do you think T. Higgins ends up? I think he remains a Cincinnati Bengal. My guess is that they slap the franchise tag on him for $26 million this offseason. That's what the franchise tag will be worth. $26 million. I think they end up working out a long-term deal, but this is just going to be a headache that we try and figure out all offseason. But after this season, I find it hard to think, if you're the Cincinnati's front office, you can't let T. Higgins walk out the door after the season he just had with Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow. So let's start here. I think he stays in Cincinnati. Where do you think he ends up in 2025?
I think he ends up with the Chargers.
Okay. All right. So you think there's a team change here even, and that could potentially, so that's interesting. If he's a Los Angeles Chargers, does that change your ranking?
Not necessarily, but okay. I think it just lowers the ceiling a bit, because obviously then he's paired up with Lab McConkey, right? Now, Lab McConkey, T. Higgins are not the same receiver, right? They will not be taken away from each other. Yes, they are on the same team, so targets are going to be few. They're going to be battling for targets. But that being said, I've got a lot of confidence that T. Higgins is a very good complementary wide receiver to any team that he will go to. If he stays in Cincinnati, if he goes to the Chargers, if he goes to Green Bay, if he goes to Carolina, wherever he goes, he's going to be a good complementary wide receiver. I think the thing that does worry me a little bit is that if he does go to a new team, we're going to see a little bit of a step back just because this Cincinnati team passed the ball at an outrageous rate this year, right? No matter where he goes, no team is going to copy that next year. So while T. Higgins still has youth on his side, has, again, massive talent as well, I think you do need to kind of, it sounds harsh to say you're going to dock him for a new team, but you do just have to realize it may have gotten as good as it will be for like the next 2 or 3 seasons.
Okay, so that's interesting then, because it seems like T. Higgins is just going to forever be the bridesmaid and never the bride, right? Like if he's with Jamar Chase in Cincinnati, he's never going to be the one. He's always going to be stuck in this B tier. And like maybe if he has an awesome season, we like pray for the optimism to continue and push him into the A tier. But I don't think anybody would be willing to do that knowing T. Higgins is a 2. Maybe when you get to New England, if he goes to New England, that's like the only spot where I could potentially see him being the bride and getting a bump into the A tier. If Mike Vrabel, brings in the right offensive mind to help out Drake May, to give Drake May a alpha target in T. Higgins. I mean, that we're speculating, but it feels like at the end of the day, no matter where you place T. Higgins, unless if it's in like a dream spot where he is in a phenomenal passing offense and is the clear wide receiver 1, he's just going to be a bridesmaid in these tiered rankings, unfortunately. And I'm afraid that's where we're kind of stuck with him. So let's move on to 2 guys then that I actually think are a fascinating conversation, because a lot of people are super excited about Jaxon Smith-Njigba. They're also excited about Ladd McConkey. And you look at their stats from week 8 on, fantasy points per game, Jaxon Smith-Njigba is the wide receiver 6, Ladd McConkey is the wide receiver 10. Fantasy points per route run, JSN the wide receiver 5, Ladd McConkey the wide receiver 4. And then in terms of the receiving yards market share from week 8 on, JSN the wide receiver 4, Ladd McConkey the wide receiver 5. JSN is the clear wide receiver 1 in Seattle now, ahead of DK Metcalf. I'm ready to make my flag plant on that. I think that's very clear at this point. JSN has overtaken DK Metcalf. But are we pulling the trigger too soon on Ladd McConkey, pushing him up this high in Dynasty rankings? Because what if the Chargers go out and get a T. Higgins? What if they bring in they wouldn't bring in a Chris Godwin that's overlapping in the slot, but like what if they trade for a cranky Garrett Wilson, right? Like there's opportunities here for the Chargers to potentially land another guy. So are we pulling the trigger too soon on Ladd McConkey?
I can see it. I can see how you could ask that, again, from the perspective that the Chargers bring someone in. I think you and I would agree that they do bring someone in, but I don't think that the player that they bring in is going to be at the level of Ladd McConkey this year. Right. Okay. So we talked about, like, I feel like the ceiling of the player that they could bring in that wide receiver room, like I said, T. Higgins, right? Yep. If T. Higgins comes in, it doesn't necessarily affect Ladd's ranking too much for me. Like you said, if they bring in a Garrett Wilson, again, pure speculation. There is literally nothing out there that says that the Chargers are looking at Garrett Wilson. But, if they bring in a Garrett Wilson, yeah, probably, right? Like, fine. Like, to me, there's a threshold to wide receiver. If the wide receiver is above that threshold, it's going to drop Ladd. But if that wide receiver doesn't meet that threshold, Ladd's going to be right here in my rankings until proven otherwise.
So this is the fascinating one, because then you look at co-rookie, or coming off their rookie season, Marvin Harrison Jr., who's at the bottom of this tier, who, I think there's still plenty of time for Marvin Harrison Jr. to leap Ladd McConkey in our dynasty rankings. It was obviously a disappointing rookie campaign. I'm not going to lay out the stats for you, because there's not much I can point to and say, well, look, what needs to change for Marv, man? What needs to change for Marv to make that leap ahead of a Ladd McConkey, ahead of Garrett Wilson, which I think is entirely possible, and get himself into that A tier with fellow rookies, Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas Jr. What needs to happen in 2025 for Marv?
Let's just make him the guy. Like, I know that you've got a Trey McBride, and I know you want to run the football, but like, let's get Marvin Harrison Jr. much more involved here. Wide receiver 32 in usage on the year.
That's just
for
stupid.
A guy that you right. Like,
stupid.
Again, our hope going into the year was that Marv, again, was going to be a Malik Nabers on this Arizona team. And we had the most confidence that Marv would turn in results right away, because he has a Kyler Murray right away. Right. versus Malik Nabers had a Daniel Jones, right? So, but for whatever reason, I think what we realized pretty early on is that this Arizona offense is not really designed to do that. It is not really designed to highlight one guy and get him the ball as many times as they can. They're going to try to spread the ball around and they're going to try to run it, as much as they can, which stinks.
Yeah.
Because Marvin Harrison Jr., for as much flack as he got this year, is much better than what he put out there this year. But nothing was made easy for him. So
right. That's what's important. Nothing came easy for Marv this year, and he wasn't winning contested catch balls. He wasn't creating as much separation. He didn't look like this smooth tactician coming out of Ohio State that we all expect him to be, and just translate to the league right away. Gotta be some more easy button stuff for Marv next year to get the ball in his hands. I couldn't agree with you more. Sorry, I cut you off before you finished, but I think that's what needs to happen is, please, can we get Marv some easy touch situations? Can we, I think there's things Marv definitely needs to improve upon, no question about it. But man, if he's not creating separation on the outside, if he's not winning those contested catch balls like we expected him to, can we please just get him some easy button stuff then? Because that will start to create more on the outside for him.
Yeah, and just so we can highlight JSN before we move on then. JSN to me is the epitome of this tier of guys that we want to put into that A tier because we see that there's talent, but we think that they're going to be right here next year because of situation, because of, I mean, for JSN specifically, Ryan Grubb is out in Seattle. So this heavy passing attack that we were all, wanting at the beginning of the year, not going to be there next year, right? And next play caller that comes in, do they want to get DK the ball, more than JSN? Or, for all of those things, right? Every single one of these receivers we believe is going to be stuck in this B tier. JSN, again, is the epitome of it because we're like, gosh darn it. JSN, uber talented. Just keep getting the ball to JSN like they were doing in the second half of the year, and good things were happening. For JSN at least, not so much Seattle, but again, JSN, fantastic player, but it just feels like he's going to be right here next year.
Let's take a quick break there, Ty. We got 3 more tiers to cover, but we got to make sure the people from Underdog Fantasy get their word in. So let's take a quick break. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back. We've covered 15 different wide receivers out of our top 36, Ty. Let's get to our mega C tier now. There are a lot of names in here, okay? For the people listening to the audio feed, I'll list them all out for you here right now, and we'll dive in and handpick a few of these players. Rashee Rice, Devonta Smith, DK Metcalf, Zay Flowers, George Pickens, Jordan Addison, Rome Odunze, Chris Olave, DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin in the C tier. There's a lot of different ways in which we could talk about this tier, man. This is just like the hodgepodge of aging production and what if. That's kind of what I'm labeling this tier. Players we're going to pick and choose. I want to start with Rashee Rice because he sits at the top of this tier. So what in the world is the rationale behind this ranking, right? He's coming off a very bad knee injury. And you have Xavier Worthy coming into his own in this Chiefs offense. How does he sit at the top of this C tier still?
Just because I think Rashee Rice is still going to have a very defined role that is not really going to be taken over by anyone in this offense, right? Like Travis Kelce isn't getting any younger. Xavier Worthy, for as good as he's been, it's been because they've stopped using him over the middle of the field and downfield. They've been using him in the short parts of the field to just get him the ball in his hands.
Finally started getting him some yak, man. Wide receiver 4 in yak the last 3 weeks of the season. I'm like, thank goodness, finally. Like,
thank goodness.
Let's get the ball into his hands. He's fast. Just give it to him, and he'll make the rest. Anyways, go ahead.
Right. So again, I think Rashee Rice is going to have a very clear role in this Kansas City offense, right? Where he's on these short crossers and he's going to get some yak opportunities himself. I'm not too worried about Xavier Worthy or any of the other receivers that they could have kind of eating into his workload.
I think when he comes back, like we're talking about Xavier Worthy getting some of those yak opportunities, like that's going to end up being Rashee Rice. I think he's just going to slide right back into that role. And so I'm more worried about Xavier Worthy being relegated to that perimeter down deep shot, blow the top off the defense role that he wasn't that successful in to start the season. So I do think it's a little bit of a risk having Rashee Rice at the top this year ahead of a Devonta Smith, right? Who definitely second fiddle to DK Metcalf or to AJ Brown, but still has enough production to his name where you could totally rank him ahead of Rashee Rice coming off of an injury. I think it gets interesting with DK Metcalf. I think it gets, do you still have him ahead of Zay Flowers and George Pickens? Like I think I would, but that's kind of like the next group of guys we're looking at. And it's like, I mean, Zay Flowers and George Pickens were outside of the top 30 in fantasy points per game this year.
Yeah. I still have Rashee ahead of both of them. I would entertain the Rashee and Zay Flowers conversation, but I pretty definitively would have Rashee ahead of Pickens.
So let's talk about Zay Flowers, George Pickens, and I'm going to throw Jordan Addison in here too, because Jordan Addison was the wide receiver 19 in fantasy points per game this year. Again, Zay Flowers, a wide receiver 32, Pickens, a wide receiver 34. This is a fascinating question because when you look at the roster construction of these teams, Zay Flowers is the clear wide receiver 1. George Pickens is the clear wide receiver 1. Jordan Addison is the clear wide receiver 2. T. Higgins light, if you will. Should this be like one of those situations where we're just factoring in offensive design more than clearest path to targets? Because it feels like we're ranking Zay Flowers and George Pickens ahead of Jordan Addison because they are the wide receiver 1s in their offense, right? Just to name it plainly. But Jordan Addison, man, he got it done this year with Sam Darnold at quarterback, right? Like, is this where we're just like KOC offense? We should just have Jordan Addison ahead of these two. Or what's keeping Zay Flowers and George Pickens ahead of Jordan Addison for you?
Partially talent, just because I think Pickens and Flowers are the better players to Jordan Addison. Not saying that Addison is a bad player at all, but
interesting. Okay.
Like
I think some people would argue with you on that.
Which is interesting. But because there's something that you can there's something that you can nitpick about each of these guys, right? For Zay Flowers, like again, clear 1 in his offense, he's going to have a high target share, but it's going to be very inconsistent because it could be a Derrick Henry game where he's running the ball 25 times. Very next game, Zay Flowers is getting 10 targets, right? George Pickens, I feel like George Pickens, for as great of a talent that he is with his big play ability, Arthur Smith being his play caller and now having no idea what they're going to do with the quarterback for next year because Russ is a free agent and Justin Fields is a free agent. You've got question marks there. Jordan Addison, quarterback question as well. Is it Darnold next year? Is it JJ McCarthy? Right. And you've got TJ Hawkinson and Justin Jefferson. So there's something to nitpick. And when I'm kind of faced with that, I'm again taking talent and I take the situation then into account of just, I'm going to take the variability, take the volatility, you could say, of a George Pickens and Zay Flowers, even though Jordan Addison also has the same volatility, but just less competition for Flowers and Pickens.
I would turn Jordan Addison into DK Metcalf, Devonta Smith, Rashee Rice. I don't know if I would turn Jordan Addison into George Pickens or Zay Flowers. Yeah. In terms of like dynasty trading, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's how I kind of look at them. Of like you can poke a hole in all of them. Of which one do you like best? Which one do you like the least? I think there's a case that Jordan Addison is actually the best out of the three in terms of where they should be ranked in dynasty formats. But I mean, I'm like you. I still have Zay and George Pickens ahead of Jordan Addison. But I'm questioning if it's like, you know what, I should just bet on the KOC system rather than the wide receiver one volume that Zay Flowers and George Pickens are going to get, because look what that got them this year. Finishes outside of the top 30 wide receivers. So just a thought exercise, and I'm entertaining there. And like, again, that's the purpose of these episodes. This is why we break down these rankings. We do some thought exercises here and say, this is how we have them ranked. Now let's actually rationalize this and talk this out. So hopefully it helps the viewer as well as you're thinking about how do you rank and value players moving forward as well. And if you do have questions about that, you can head over to our Discord, which is down in the description of the audio podcast or YouTube video you are listening to as well, if you want to talk some more Dynasty over there as well. Chris Olave, I'm going to skip over Rome Odunze and DJ Moore. We'll get back to them in a moment. I don't know. What do we do with Chris Olave? What do you do?
Keep him right here.
Well, but
because...
Okay, let's get out of the rankings. I don't think anybody's going to sit here and look and say, like, yeah, Chris Olave should be higher. People might say he should be lower, but like, screw rankings. You keep him in this tier. Absolutely, 100% agree. You're a dynasty manager of Chris Olave. What do you do? Tell me, because I am one of them. I have zero clue what to do with him. I mean, I have ideas, but like, I'm guessing a lot of managers are just like, I'm stuck with him.
I feel like you have to either hold him right now because there's going to be not much of a market for him, or you got to package him up and go trade then for a Terry McLaurin or
for Terry McLaurin.
Because I think,
all right, I just assumed you were going to go a tier up, and I'm like, yes, I'm packaging a first and Chris Olave, and I'm trying to get anybody in the top 3 tiers ahead of him.
You can do that too, but I think like if you're trying to find like some cheaper alternatives, like Terry McLaurin is perfect, right? A guy that isn't hitting that like 31, 32-year-old cliff just yet, still the number one in their offense with a good quarterback, right? Like, again, cheaper alternatives, like Terry McLaurin's your guy, but like you said, if you're going to package a first and a Olave to try to go tier up to I don't think you're going to give Marv just 1 year in, but
you might. With how disappointing his rookie year was, I think you could.
Yeah, with the right manager, you might be able to.
With the right manager, you might be able to.
I think you can try your best to move Olave, but you're going to have to sweeten the deal a little bit because no one's going to take Olave just straight up.
And I would agree with that. Nobody wants Chris Olave, so I am holding in my league unless if somebody comes up with a mouth-watering offer and wants Chris Olave, or if I can throw him in as like a sweetener in a larger deal that's actually not centered around Chris Olave, I'd be fine moving on from him then. But you cannot do a trade centered around Chris Olave right now because his value is literally probably rock bottom, if not borderline rock bottom. Rome Odunze, DJ Moore. We have Rome Odunze ranked ahead of DJ Moore in our dynasty rankings. We don't need to compare notes and stats here. DJ Moore very clearly had the better season than Rome Odunze in 2024. Is this just simply an age thing? Is that all it is for you?
Yeah, probably. I also just think Rome Odunze is an uber talented wide receiver.
Yes.
And, DJ Moore going into his age 28 season here. So that's, again, the age thing that you have brought up. There is an out in DJ Moore's contract in 2 seasons when he's going to be 30. Yeah. So I think if Odunze takes enough leaps to that point where there's the out, DJ Moore might actually want out then because he's not going to be the one in that offense then. So a lot of different things, but age certainly has some weight to it.
You can put DJ Moore ahead of Rome still in your dynasty rankings. I'm okay with that, but I'm with you. I still think Rome is such an uber talented wide receiver that he'll make do on his draft day cost. I wouldn't be surprised if it's next year even, right? Like I don't see how they don't get him more involved next year because I still think he's so uber talented and plays such a good complement on the opposite perimeter from Rome Odunze or from DJ Moore, excuse me. Last player in this tier, Terry McLaurin. Ty, we got to ask the question: is this just simply too low? Terry had a phenomenal season this year, phenomenal first playoff game, 7 receptions for over 80 yards and a score. I mean, Terry's just doing it, and he's got a young cornerstone quarterback that he can play with for the next 3-4 years to come. Like, should Terry be higher? Should we get over this age thing and just say Terry's producing He's attached to one of the most promising young quarterbacks in the league. Therefore, age is just a number. Like, let's put him ahead of Zay Flowers, for crying out loud. Like, is Terry one of those guys? Like, I'm questioning if he should actually be towards the top of this tier.
I feel like from just a production perspective, Terry is towards the top of this tier, right? Because of what you said. To me, I think he is in this C tier still, just because, again, you put him into that B tier with the young guys, right? Lad, JSNT. It doesn't, I don't think you can justify Terry McLaurin from a longevity perspective in the B tier. And partially for me, I think there's a chance Washington brings in another receiver, because you can't have your wide receiver 2 be a rotating door between Olamide Zaccheaus and Jamison Crowder and Luke McCaffrey and De'Ami Brown and Zach Ertz and Ben Sinnott. And you get my point. Yeah. Like, if they bring in another guy, I think it does get a little complicated then for Terry. So again, from a production standpoint, he's certainly towards the top, because again, he was the most productive guy. Longevity standpoint, he is in the C tier. There's no other way around it.
Let's quickly breeze through. I shouldn't say breeze through. Breeze is such a gentle term, but like the D tier, I kind of want to just call this tier, because I don't like. There's so many different. Yeah, right. There's so many different ways you can look at this tier, because you could compare Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill, but it's 2 Miami Dolphins wide receivers who have the same issue. Can Tua Tagovailoa stay on the field? If not, they decline in value immensely. And even what we saw of the Dolphins this year was a regressed version with what we saw in 2023. So, like, it's Tua Tagovailoa dependent for both of those guys, and really it's Tyreek Hill dependent for himself on whether he's a Miami Dolphin or not. And he's 31 years old, nearing the top of that age cliff for him. You got a scrunched look on your face.
I see why Cam is not on this episode, because he has Jalen Waddle all the way at wide receiver 21, and we got Waddle.
Is that true? That can't be true.
Yeah, I think so.
That can't be true.
21.
Okay. All right.
That's again.
That's a choice, Cameron. That's a choice.
It's certainly a choice.
That's a choice.
I'm gonna put a bow on each of these guys here in this tier. Tyreek and Mike Evans are in this tier. Production doesn't say that they're D tier, but just from an age perspective, they are, right?
Yes.
Chris Godwin.
That's how we'll write those off. Yep.
Yeah. Chris Godwin coming off a nasty
injury. Yeah.
Like
leg injury.
There is just some limited expectations for when he comes back, because he is going to be 28, 29 then, right?
Yeah. Right.
Xavier Worthy, Jameson Williams, speedsters in good offenses. I'm not ready to push them any higher just yet, because I don't think the sophomore leap or the third-year leap for these guys are going to be anything like spectacular.
How much can we pause on that one for a sec? Because we'll come back to Ayuk. How much momentum do you think carries into 2025 for each of these guys? Because I think that's the question with both of them. Because you've got 2 guys ahead of him. You've got Rashee Rice ahead of Xavier Worthy, most likely. You've got Amon-Ra St. Brown ahead of Jameson Williams. What if Ben Johnson isn't on the Detroit Lions anymore? Does that kill any momentum for Jameson Williams? Can we see like a final 3-week stretch for Xavier Worthy where actually, you know what, he starts mixing in over the middle of the field more, and Andy Reid quits trying to hide him on the perimeter and just make him a deep threat guy? Like, how much momentum carries over for each of these guys? Like, that's the big question for them. And I don't expect you to have a long-winded answer, but that's the questions I have for each of them and why I can't put them any higher.
For Jameson Williams, hacking up a long over here. Jeez. I think Ben Johnson was a big part of Jameson Williams' development, and I think that development slows down even more if Ben Johnson leaves. For Xavier Worthy, at least you've got Andy Reid still, so I see more. I would have more hope than for Xavier Worthy, but for me, again, you're mixing in a Rashee Rice. You still, again, for when I dog Travis Kelce for calling him an aging target. He's still going to be around. Isaiah Pacheco is going to be healthy. Like, it does get more complicated for Xavier Worthy when everyone's healthy.
Brandon Ayuk, this is simply injury, right? Like, should he be higher?
Oh my word, I can't, because the offense can only support you so much.
Sure.
Because for me, Ayuk, I didn't get the money that he was asking for, and that he eventually got.
Yep.
I don't get what it is for Ayuk. He is someone that I'm definitely going to look to move, but the problem is he's coming off the injury. So
yes, right.
I've got really no interest is not the right word, but no interest with Brandon Ayuk.
Ayuk is the definition of a hold in Dynasty, because you know what the 49ers are going to do? They're going to bring everyone back and run it back next year, because they had so many injury troubles. You know, you're playing with an aging Christian McCaffrey who's probably only got like 1 or 2 good years left. You've got, you know, literally an all-pro left tackle in Trent Williams. You have to run it back with him. He's 36 years old, but you got to run it back. Like, this is your window still. And if it's not next year, then we could talk about what happens for, you know, this offense and how do they make Brandon Ayuk more of a focal point? Does he make strides forward then? But Brandon Ayuk is the epitome of a hold fresh off of an injury in Dynasty formats. The E tier, look, this is who wraps out our top 36. You could probably put about 8 other guys into this tier as well, but it's Jayden Reed, Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, and Josh Downs. I also know why Cameron isn't on this episode, because he has Cortland Sutton ranked as his Dynasty wide receiver 39. I have him at 31. You have him at 33. Cam's got him at 39.
Well, and then what makes it
plummets it below Jerry Jeudy and Jayden Reed.
Well,
again, this tier, age doesn't matter. Give me the production. Age doesn't matter in this tier for me anymore. Give me the production. Like, Cortland Sutton, he should be below Mike Evans and a Tyreek Hill, absolutely. But like, God,
well,
come on,
I mean, the only guy that I can nitpick here is Jerry Jeudy, just because I think he's a really good number 2. I don't see him as a number 1 versus Jayden Reed and Cortland Sutton. They can produce as the number 1s in their offense. Not saying that they are number 1s in their offense. I mean, Cortland Sutton is obviously the one, because Marvin Mims is not.
No. Hey, manufactured touches though. Dude is god with manufactured touches.
Yeah, what was that about 29.5 receiving yards against the Bills?
Hey, you know what? Let me pull up his design. Let me pull up his design touches. Where is he at? Back half of the season.
Never mind. This is not worth it. It's not.
It's not worth getting into design touches. It was a stupid number over the back half of the season that he had design touches.
But again, like, each of these guys, you're just taking the production. Again, I think the Jerry Jeudy production is going to take a hit next year. Cortland Sutton obviously is going to be the one for Bo Nix. Jayden Reed, it just frustrates me with Green Bay that they just don't get him the ball more, because he is by and far the best receiver that they have, but they just only give him 6 targets a game. And it's like, why? Because we want to spread the ball around there, keep the defense guessing. Well, you can keep the defense guessing when you've got Jayden Reed riding slot fades and running short, crossers over the middle. You can keep him guessing that way, but Matt LaFleur thinks he's just smarter than everyone else, and that's why they lost in the playoffs. I'm just going to say it.
Well, I mean, I do think there's something there with Matt LaFleur. Just like, cut it out, stop being cute. Like, just get the ball to your best option. Anyways, we'll wrap up the episode there, because again, you could throw a ton of guys in that last year, and you could probably say Cortland Sutton should be higher. You can blame Cameron for that one. You can leave all your hate mail in the comments for him. Feel free to use that space.
What a wild world that we're going to leave hate comments because of Cortland Sutton of all receivers being too low. Wow.
That's going to be the people's last concern of this episode. It's like, who cares about Cortland Sutton, man? You have Jaxon Smith-Njigba in the B tier. It's going to be Garrett Wilson is a C tier. That's people are going to be so much more concerned about that before anything else. Hey, look, I'm always open to hearing people's opinions and comments down below. I think Dynasty is so much more nuanced when it comes to rankings. So if you want to go ahead and leave your thoughts down there, we're totally open to hearing them. I think people get a little hostile about it, but it's like, in Dynasty, there's a whole lot more room for ambiguity and like personal opinion, roster construction, everything of the sort. So like, Dynasty rankings feel a lot more ambiguous than redraft rankings. So I love hearing people's thoughts. Leave them down in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you all. Again, if you're not subscribed, turn on those notifications as well, so you know when all of our newest content is up, because we got so many more Dynasty themed episodes coming out for you all. We've got buys and sells, we've got rising stars, we're going to have rookie content, rookie rankings, everything of the sorts. We're really going to get into the nitty gritty of Dynasty this all season, so make sure you're around and catch all of our content around that as well. Thanks for hanging out. I am at Lucas Wenzel on X, Tyler_Plath for Tyler. TikTok is going away, so make sure you follow us, our shorts on the other socials as well. FFL is on Twitter Twitter, the FFLs on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas on Facebook, Fantasy Football Fellas Shorts on YouTube. We'll see you all later this week for the tight end rankings. We'll see you then. Deuces.